The sun burned hot over the Naval Academy's training field, cutting sharp lines across the rows of silent cadets. It was one of those Maryland mornings where the air itself felt like discipline, clean, precise, and heavy with expectation. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the field, her boots still, her shadow long. Around her, the young recruits gathered in formation, their crisp uniforms gleaming, their faces unreadable masks of pride and nerves. They didn't know her yet, not really. And she preferred it that way. She had learned long ago that silence revealed more than words ever could. From the sidelines, a group of cadets whispered, the kind of laughter that pretends to be harmless but isn't. One of them, Cadet James Reynolds, leaned slightly toward his friends. His voice carried farther than he realized. "That's our special instructor," he said, smirking. "Thought we were getting someone from Team 6, not a recruiting poster." A ripple of low amusement passed among them. Sarah heard it, she always heard it. She didn't react, her face unreadable, her eyes calm as she flipped through her clipboard. She had encountered this tone 1,000 times before, from boardrooms to battlefields. Doubt, sharpened by arrogance. The sun glared down, but it wasn't the heat that tightened her shoulders, it was memory. Afghanistan, Helmand Province. Sand, fire. A voice over the radio that never answered again. She blinked it away. Not here, not now. "Cadets," she called out finally, her voice smooth and level, cutting clean through the murmurs. "I'm Lieutenant Mitchell. For the next 8 weeks, you'll be learning advanced close-quarters combat and tactical decision-making." No shout, no bluster, just authority wrapped in quiet. Some instructors barked to command attention. Sarah didn't need to. Her tone did the work for her, the kind of calm that comes from surviving places where noise could mean death. A few cadets straightened unconsciously, others didn't. She continued, "Some of you might have questions about my qualifications. Save them. By the end of today, you won't have any." Silence, even the wind seemed to hold still. Her gaze swept across the rows, stopping for a fraction of a second on Reynolds, the smirking one. The kind that hid insecurity behind inherited confidence. His uniform fit perfectly, his posture textbook. His eyes, though, betrayed him, calculating, watchful. The kind of cadet who needed to learn through consequences, not lectures. Sarah returned her attention to her notes, but inside she already knew how this day would end. She'd seen it before, young men testing limits, convinced they were indestructible. Some learned humility through guidance, others through pain. Either way, she would teach. She gestured toward the tables lined with training weapons. "We'll begin with disarmament scenarios. Your weapon is your lifeline, but it can also become your greatest vulnerability. Today, you'll learn to protect it or lose it." The cadets moved, boots crunching on the gravel. They picked up their gear, rubber sidearms, practice rifles modified to deliver a mild shock when fired. Enough to sting, to remind, to humble. As Sarah moved among them, correcting stances and wrist angles, she caught fragments of conversation. Reynolds again, talking too loud. "My father served with Lieutenant O'Hare's grandson," he said, smirking. "Says these diversity appointments are killing combat readiness." The words struck, but Sarah's expression didn't change. She'd faced worse insults from men who wore real weapons and meant every word. Words couldn't wound what the battlefield had already hardened. Still, something quiet stirred inside her, a flicker of sadness, not anger. Because arrogance like his wasn't born, it was taught. And arrogance like that could get people killed. She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "Reynolds," she said, "pair up with Wilson. Let's see if you can match words with action." He grinned as if he'd won something. The other cadets began their drills, movements clumsy but improving. Sarah guided them patiently, showing how to pivot, redirect force, disarm without brute strength. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She believed in control, because she had lost it once. Her mind flashed back to a night in Kandahar, a sandstorm, an ambush, the sound of breathing over a comms line, and then nothing. She'd been 27, covered in dust and blood, leading 3 survivors out of a kill zone while every instinct screamed to run. That was the night she stopped fearing death. Not because she wanted to die, but because she'd already lived what came before it. Now, as she watched these cadets stumble through their drills, she realized how fragile they were beneath the bravado. Young, bright, unshaped. Reynolds, though, wasn't learning. He moved lazily, sloppily. His partner Wilson laughed every time one of them missed a grip. Sarah made her way toward them, each step measured. "Cadets," she said evenly, "demonstrate the proper counter to a front disarm." Reynolds looked up, smirk still in place. "Perhaps, Lieutenant, you could show us yourself. We're having trouble visualizing." It wasn't a request, it was a dare. Nearby cadets stopped practicing. The air thickened. Everyone knew what was happening, even if no one said it out loud. Sarah nodded slowly. "Of course, Cadet, I'll play defender, proceed when ready." But she noticed something in his posture, a slight shift in his stance, the glance toward Wilson and 2 others. It was coordinated, pre-planned. Her instincts sharpened. Still, she didn't move. She'd let them play it out. Reynolds gave a small nod. Wilson and 2 other cadets, Tanner and Briggs, moved in, forming a loose circle around her. It wasn't part of the drill, it was something else. A test, a line being crossed. Then Reynolds stepped closer, lifted his training weapon, pressed it to her temple. The metal was cold against her skin. The laughter stopped. The entire yard froze. "Let's make this realistic," Reynolds said, loud enough for everyone to hear. 4 armed hostiles, 1 unarmed woman. What's your tactical assessment, Lieutenant?" The challenge hung in the air like a storm about to break. From her office window, Colonel Mayor Tangisdal, the commanding officer, watched in silence. Her hand hovered over the radio, ready to intervene. But she didn't. Not yet. She wanted to see how her instructor would respond. Sarah didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on Reynolds, calm, unblinking. "Interesting scenario modification," she said softly. 4 against 1 does seem unfair." A pause. "Your first mistake," she added, "was assuming I'm unarmed." Before anyone could process it, she moved. The shift was so fast it seemed impossible, her left hand snapping up, deflecting the barrel, twisting his wrist. The gun clattered to the ground. In the same motion, her foot swept his legs, sending him crashing into the dirt. Wilson lunged. Sarah sidestepped, used his own momentum to drive him into Tanner. Their bodies hit the ground in a tangle. Briggs froze mid-aim. "Drop it," she commanded. He hesitated. She fired Reynolds's fallen weapon once, just a training shot, the harmless electric sting lighting up Briggs's hand. He yelped, weapon falling. 5 seconds, that's all it took. And then silence. The entire field stood frozen, 3 cadets down, 1 disarmed. The lieutenant unmoving, weapon leveled, not even breathing hard. When she spoke, her tone was almost a whisper. "Second mistake, believing numbers guarantee victory." She looked at Reynolds, still on the ground, his pride fractured more than his wrist. "During my second tour, I was separated from my unit near Kandahar. 6 insurgents surrounded me. They thought I was an easy target." She paused. They were wrong. No one dared speak. Then the loudspeaker cracked. Colonel Tangisdal's voice carried across the field. "Lieutenant Mitchell, my office. Bring Cadet Reynolds and his friends." Sarah lowered the weapon. The silence remained heavy as she extended her hand to Reynolds. He hesitated, then took it, wincing as she pulled him to his feet. Her voice dropped low for him alone. "The third mistake, Cadet," she said, "was not researching your opponent." He looked at her, confused, ashamed. "I trained under Lieutenant Audie Murphy's grandson," she continued. "He taught me that size and gender mean nothing in combat, Only skill, only will. She stepped back, her tone soft but steady. You'll remember that. And she walked away slowly, deliberately, each step echoing louder than any reprimand could. The cadets watched her go, their faces pale, their respect earned in silence. Because what they'd seen wasn't just skill, it was restraint. It was control, the kind forged in fire, in nights where courage wasn't about fighting, but surviving long enough to choose when not to. And as the field returned to motion, something unseen shifted in its air. The arrogance, the laughter, it had died there quietly, beside the fallen pride of four young men who had just learned a lesson they would never forget. Sarah didn't smile, she didn't need to. The point had been made. Inside, though, as she walked toward the administrative building with Reynolds and his team following behind, something in her softened. Not pity, something quieter. Recognition. Because once, long ago, she'd been them. Cocky, certain, convinced she understood the world. Until the world proved her wrong. As the doors closed behind her, the echo of that memory stayed, like the hum of an old battlefield still alive in her blood. And though the cadets would write this day in whispers and rumors, the truth was simpler. They hadn't just faced a Navy SEAL. They'd faced what war makes of someone who refuses to break. And that was far more terrifying than any weapon. The office was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Each second landed heavy, like footsteps approaching judgment. Four cadets stood at rigid attention, faces pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Reynolds's wrist was swollen and bruised where Sarah had disarmed him. Wilson's shoulder twitched with the dull ache of impact. Tanner and Briggs kept their eyes locked on a fixed point somewhere above the colonel's head, their confidence drained and scattered. Colonel Mayor Tangisdal sat behind her desk, unmoving. Her reputation preceded her, first African-American woman to pilot the U-2 spy plane, 25 years of service, and a gaze that could strip a man of his rank without a word. Beside her stood Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, hands folded behind her back. Calm, collected, almost too calm. The colonel finally spoke, her voice controlled but edged with quiet fury. Cadets, in my 17 years commanding this academy, I've seen arrogance, I've seen mistakes, but I have never seen anything this reckless. Her words fell like hammer strikes. You aimed a weapon at a superior officer, she continued. In combat, that's treason. In training, it's grounds for immediate dismissal. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? No one answered. Reynolds's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Answer me, Cadet Reynolds, Tangisdal snapped. Yes, ma'am. His voice cracked on the second word. The colonel's eyes narrowed. And tell me, was it worth it? Reynolds's throat bobbed as he swallowed. No, ma'am. Then tell me what it was. A pause, his voice dropped. A mistake. Tangisdal leaned back, exhaling through her nose. A mistake gets people killed, Cadet, instructors, teammates, civilians. You think a joke, a show of bravado is harmless. No one moved. The colonel's gaze shifted to Sarah. Lieutenant Mitchell, you've requested to handle their discipline personally. Are you sure about this? Sarah's eyes stayed fixed ahead. Yes, ma'am, they need to learn. Dismissal would be mercy. Tangisdal studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod. Very well, the cadets are yours. Sarah stepped forward. The air shifted with her presence, not loud, not commanding, but weighty in its calm. Tomorrow at 0500, she said evenly, you four will report to the obstacle course. You'll train with me, 2 weeks, before regular classes. You'll learn what it means to earn your uniform. Wilson blinked, startled. 2 weeks, ma'am. Sarah's expression didn't change. You'll wake before the sun and work until it sets if you have to. You'll carry logs, crawl through mud, learn endurance, patience, and humility. And when you're too tired to move, you'll remember today. You'll remember what almost cost you everything. Her tone softened slightly. not kind but human. I'm not recommending dismissal because I see potential, but potential means nothing without transformation. Reynolds shifted his weight. He finally looked at her directly, eyes unsteady but sincere. "Permission to speak, ma'am." "Granted." "Why give us another chance?" His voice trembled between guilt and disbelief. "We disrespected you, threatened you. You had every right to end this, end us." Sarah regarded him quietly. There was something almost sad in her eyes. "Because someone once gave me one," she said. The words landed softly, but their weight filled the room. "When I was a cadet," she continued, "I made a mistake not so different from yours. I thought I knew better, thought experience could be replaced with ego." She looked at her reflection faintly visible in the colonel's window. "Lieutenant Susan Annity gave me a second chance. She didn't break me. She built me." Sarah took a step closer to Reynolds. "Leadership isn't about punishment, cadet. It's about transformation. The battlefield doesn't need more soldiers. It needs better human beings." The room fell silent again. Tangisdal finally stood, closing the file on her desk. Then it settled, dismissed. The cadets saluted, then turned toward the door. As they left, Reynolds glanced back once. Sarah met his gaze, neither anger nor forgiveness in her eyes, just quiet expectation. He nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, then left. When the door shut, Tangisdal exhaled. "You handled that with restraint." Sarah allowed a faint smile. "Restraint's the hardest lesson to teach." Tangisdal studied her face. "You think they'll learn?" Sarah's answer came after a beat. "They will, one way or another." The colonel leaned forward. "You've changed since Kandahar." Sarah's eyes flickered just once. "Everyone changes, ma'am. Some of us just stop pretending we haven't." Tangisdal nodded slowly. "Good work today. You reminded them what strength looks like." When Sarah left the office, the hallway was empty. The echo of her boots trailed her like memory. Outside, the late afternoon light washed over the academy grounds. Cadets marched in formation. The flag caught a breeze and snapped sharp against the sky. Sarah paused near the training field. The place looked different now, quieter, humbled. She stood there a long time, watching the next class of recruits run drills, their shouts of exertion echoing against the steel bleachers. She should have felt satisfaction, but she didn't. All she felt was the quiet ache of memory. That night she couldn't sleep. Her quarters were immaculate, every corner sharp, every item in its place, but her mind was. It drifted back to faces long gone, the men she couldn't save, the missions that changed her. The smell of dust and gun oil, the scream of incoming rounds. The moment she realized fear wasn't the enemy, complacency was. She sat on the edge of her bunk, hands clasped, eyes unfocused. The knock on her door startled her. "Come in," she said. It was Colonel Tangisdal again, off duty now, the starch gone from her uniform, her voice gentler. "Can't sleep." Sarah smiled faintly. "That obvious?" Tangisdal crossed her arms. "I know that look, seen it in mirrors." Sarah gestured toward the empty chair. "You ever think about the ones you couldn't help?" The colonel sat. "Every night, but you don't carry them to punish yourself. You carry them to remind yourself why you keep teaching." Sarah nodded slowly. "They'll change, you know," Tangisdal said. "Reynolds, his type always does if you hit them in the right place. Not the body, the pride." Sarah's lips curved in a faint, sad smile. "Pride breaks cleaner than bone." The colonel laughed softly. "You're learning to sound like me." "Not yet," Sarah said. "You still drink your coffee black. I'm not that far gone." Tangisdal stood, her hand resting briefly on Sarah's shoulder. "You did good today. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow, going to hurt for them and maybe for you too." After she left, Sarah sat in silence for a while longer. The night outside was still, the moonlight silvering the field below. Somewhere, a bell sounded the hour. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in years, she prayed. not for strength but for clarity. Dawn broke pale and cold. Reynolds was the first to arrive at the obstacle course, his uniform damp with dew. He hadn't slept much either. The humiliation of yesterday clung to him like smoke. He looked around. The course stretched before him, ropes, walls, trenches. It seemed to go on forever. Wilson, Tanner, and Briggs arrived soon after, bleary-eyed, silent. At 0500 sharp, Sarah appeared. She wore no rank insignia today, just a plain black training uniform. Her hair tied back, expression unreadable. No words, no greetings. "Run," she said simply. And they did. Mud splashed, boots sank, lungs burned. The first 10 minutes were chaos, tripping, slipping, cursing. But Sarah didn't yell, didn't correct, she just watched. After 30 minutes, Wilson collapsed beside a low wall, gasping for air. "On your feet," Sarah said quietly. He staggered up, fell again. Reynolds stepped in without thinking, hauling his friend upright. Sarah noticed, didn't comment. Another wall, another fall, more mud. 2 hours passed, then 3. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the cadets were broken, physically at least. Sarah finally called them in. They stood before her, trembling, soaked, eyes hollow but alert. "This," she said softly, "is what real combat feels like. Not the glamour you see in films, not the medals, just exhaustion, fear, and decisions made with no time to think." She walked slowly down the line, her tone almost reflective now. "Out there, no one cares where you come from or who your father served with. Out there, it's about survival, and survival starts here with respect." She stopped in front of Reynolds. Their eyes met again, no hostility now, just something raw and uncertain. "You'll report here again tomorrow, and every day after until you understand why I'm not your enemy." He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah gave a short nod. "Good," dismissed. They didn't walk away. They stumbled, limping toward the barracks, mud streaking their uniforms. And as Sarah watched them go, she finally felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Because transformation didn't happen in victories. It began in humiliation, in failure, in the breaking of the self that thought it already knew everything. She turned her face toward the sunrise, eyes half closed against its brightness. Some lessons hurt more than wounds. But those were the ones that stayed. The rain started on the 5th morning. Cold, sharp drops slicing through the dawn haze, soaking the dirt course until it turned into a field of sludge. The cadets hated it. Sarah loved it. Rain stripped away pretense. No one looked impressive when they were covered in mud and trembling. Rain was an equalizer. It didn't care who you were. Reynolds climbed the rope wall for the 3rd time that morning, hands raw, uniform plastered to his skin. Every movement burned. He could feel the weight of failure pressing on his shoulders like a ghost. Wilson was just behind him, teeth clenched, eyes unfocused. Sarah watched from below, silent as ever. She didn't shout instructions or encouragement. She just observed, the way she'd once watched teammates fight to stay alive in the mountains of Nuristan, wordless, disciplined, unbreakable. The only sound was the rain and the breath of the breaking. When Reynolds reached the top, his grip slipped, and he slammed against the wooden beam with a grunt. Wilson reached out instinctively, grabbing his wrist. "Got you," he gasped. Reynolds looked down, mud dripping from his chin. "Don't." "Shut up," Wilson snapped, pulling him up. Both men rolled over the edge, panting. Sarah's voice floated up, calm but sharp as glass. "Finally, something worth watching." Reynolds turned his head, breath ragged. "Teamwork, ma'am." Her gaze stayed fixed on him. "Humanity." He didn't answer, just stared at the clouds, rain pelting his face. It wasn't the physical pain that was breaking him. It was the silence. The way Sarah never yelled, never gloated, never mocked. Her calmness unnerved him. It forced him to hear himself think. And he didn't like what he was hearing. By the seventh day, even Briggs, the quietest of the four, cracked. It happened during a forced march through the flooded ravine at dusk. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick and heavy, like the sky hadn't decided whether to let go or hold back. Sarah led them from the front, boots cutting through the shallow water. The cadets followed in silence, shoulders slumped, eyes distant. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she finally called a halt, Briggs stumbled to his knees. His breathing came in shallow, panicked bursts. "I can't," he muttered, shaking his head. "I can't anymore." The others froze. Sarah turned slowly, her face unreadable. "Stand up, cadet." He didn't move. "I said stand up." Briggs's head dropped. "You don't understand, ma'am. My body, done, my hands there." Sarah crouched beside him. Her voice softened, barely a whisper. "Your hands are shaking because your mind's losing control. The body follows the mind, Briggs. You don't quit because you're weak. You quit because you've convinced yourself there's no point." He looked up at her, eyes glassy with frustration. "Then what's the point?" Her answer came quiet but certain. "To find out who you are when everything else is stripped away." She stood and looked at the others. "Help him up." Reynolds hesitated for half a second, then reached down, gripping Briggs by the arm. Wilson followed. Together they pulled him to his feet. And Sarah said nothing more. The march continued. That night none of them spoke at dinner. The cafeteria's hum of conversation filled the space, but at their table nothing, just the sound of metal trays and quiet chewing. Sarah sat 2 tables away, watching them discreetly. She could see the fatigue setting in, the kind that didn't show on muscle but in the eyes. That hollow stare soldiers got when they started to confront the truth about themselves. She'd seen that look before, in her reflection years ago. After the ambush. After they pulled her from the rubble. She remembered the medic's face, young, terrified, hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding from her leg. She remembered thinking how strange it was to feel so calm while someone else panicked for her. She had survived that night, but part of her never left. And now, watching these cadets, she realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. Maybe she'd been trying to train that broken part of herself out of existence. The next morning she arrived earlier than usual. The field was still dark, the air cold enough to sting. She waited. The first cadet to arrive was Reynolds. He didn't look at her, just nodded once and started stretching. Wilson and Tanner showed up minutes later, followed by Briggs, still sore, still limping but standing. "Form up," Sarah said quietly. They did. She paced in front of them. "You've been running, climbing, crawling for a week, but what you've really been doing is fighting yourselves. Pride, doubt, fear." No one moved. "Today we change the rhythm," she continued. "No more drills, you'll face a live simulation. 4-man team, time limit, 1 hour. Objective, extract a hostage from the training compound." Wilson frowned. "Hostage, ma'am." Sarah nodded. "A test of coordination, patience, and communication. You'll have to plan, adapt, execute. You'll fail if you try to be heroes." Reynolds looked at his teammates. "Understood, ma'am." Sarah studied him for a moment. Something had shifted in his tone. Less edge, more awareness. "Then let's begin." The exercise was brutal. The compound was a maze of corridors, narrow alleys, and mock enemy posts. Smoke grenades filled the air, visibility near zero. At first the cadets stumbled, barking over each other, losing formation. Wilson tripped over a fallen barrier. Tanner fired too early, alerting the hostiles. Sarah watched from the surveillance room, her face lit by the grainy feed. She didn't intervene. The lesson had to come from failure. 20 minutes in, the cadets regrouped. Reynolds took the lead, quieter now, more deliberate. "Wilson, left flank. Briggs, cover rear. Tanner, you're with me," he whispered into his comm. They moved like shadows through the fog. For the first time, Sarah saw something resembling unity. When they reached the hostage, a dummy placed inside a mock bunker, Briggs hesitated. The fake detonator light blinked red beside it. "Booby trap," Reynolds muttered. Wilson swallowed hard. "What now?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. His breathing steadied. "We adapt." He used the butt of his rifle to knock the detonator aside, disarming it in one smooth motion. "Extraction secure. Move." They completed the simulation, with seconds to spare. When they emerged from the compound, soaked in sweat and smoke, Sarah was waiting. "Report," she said simply. Reynolds saluted. "Objective complete, ma'am. Hostage secured. No casualties." Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened. "Not bad, Cadet. Improvement noted." Wilson exhaled in disbelief. "Did we actually pass?" Sarah allowed herself a faint smile. "No one passes the first time, but you didn't break. That's progress." She turned to leave, but Reynolds called out, "Ma'am." She stopped. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Why do you push us so hard? It's not just discipline, it's personal, isn't it?" The air grew heavy. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Sarah didn't turn around. Her voice came low, distant. "Because one day, the only thing standing between life and death will be what you learned here, and I want you to have something real to hold on to when that day comes." She walked away before they could see the flicker in her eyes, that old, haunted light. Later that night, alone in her quarters, she opened a drawer and pulled out a letter. The paper was yellowed, creased from being folded too often, the handwriting small, uneven. "Lieutenant Mitchell, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I just wanted to thank you. Because of you, I lived long enough to tell my daughter I loved her. You probably don't remember me. Kandahar, 2012. You dragged me out when the building collapsed. I remember your hands shaking. You said, 'We're not done yet.' Neither are you. SGT, Daniel Reeves." She traced the signature with her finger, her throat tightening. She remembered him now. The smell of burning dust, the weight of his body over her shoulder, the sound of explosions behind them. He hadn't made it home. Not really. A year after that letter arrived, she got another from his wife. He passed in his sleep, said he dreamt of the desert, said you were there smiling. Sarah folded the letters carefully and put them away. Then she sat on the floor, back against the bed, the quiet pressing in around her. The cadets thought she was teaching them discipline, but she was really teaching them something else, how to live with ghosts, how to turn regret into purpose. The next morning when she walked onto the field, something about her felt different, softer, but stronger too. The cadets noticed. They didn't speak, but they stood straighter, saluted cleaner, moved sharper. Respect wasn't demanded anymore. It was earned quietly, completely. And as Sarah watched them move in unison beneath the rising sun, she felt something unexpected stir inside her chest. Peace. It didn't last. It never did. But for that moment, it was enough. Because sometimes, leadership wasn't about commanding fear. It was about inspiring redemption. And sometimes, the hardest soldier to save was the one who'd already survived too much. The desert doesn't whisper, it hums. At first it sounds like silence, endless and soft, but if you stand long enough, you can hear it breathe. The hum of heat, the faint rattle of wind against metal, the pulse of something ancient beneath your boots. Kandahar. The name still carried the weight of ghosts. Even now, years later, Sarah could smell it, gunpowder, sand, blood, and diesel. It lived in her bones, in the back of her throat, in the thin scar that ran just above her knee. It was her third tour. The mission was supposed to be clean, routine, a simple extraction, retrieve an intelligence officer held by insurgents in a small village compound north of the Helmand River. But missions like that were never clean. Nothing in war ever was. It started at dusk. The team had inserted by Hello 2 clicks east of the target zone. 6 SEALs, 1 interpreter. Sarah was point, leading them through the dust storms that bled the horizon red. The setting sun turned everything into silhouette, even the men behind her. She remembered the way the wind cut through her gear, the way the world looked just before something terrible happened. They reached the compound without sound. The plan was simple: breach, extract, exfil. 10 minutes in and out. But the plan didn't account for the child. He couldn't have been older than 8, standing in the alley, eyes wide, holding a clay pot, the kind that carried water. He froze when he saw them. Sarah raised her hand. Stop. The team halted behind her. The boy blinked once, then dropped the pot and ran. The explosion threw them all to the ground. The shockwave hit like a fist, dust, fire, screaming metal. The world went sideways. Sarah tasted blood. Her ears rang. Her rifle was gone. She could see shadows moving, insurgents, shouting in Pashto, closing in fast. 2 of her men were down. A third was trapped beneath a collapsed wall. She could barely hear the radio. Static, someone yelling, "We're compromised, extraction impossible." She tried to stand, but her leg wouldn't move. She looked down, shrapnel embedded deep into her thigh, dark blood soaking her uniform. Fear flickered, then discipline took over. She dragged herself toward the nearest body, Chief Petty Officer Harris. His chest wasn't moving. Another explosion. Closer this time. She didn't think, she just moved. Crawling through debris, dragging herself toward the man pinned under the wall. The interpreter, Alam. "Stay with me," she shouted, her voice raw. His eyes were wild with terror. "They're coming, Lieutenant, go." "Not leaving you." She found a broken pipe, jammed it under the edge of the wall, and pushed with everything left in her arms. The metal groaned, shifted, gave an inch, then another. Gunfire cracked nearby, dust rained down. Come on," she muttered through her teeth. Finally, the slab moved enough for him to crawl free. "Move," she shouted, shoving him toward the alley. They limped together through the smoke, every muscle screaming. The rest of the team had regrouped near the north wall, 2 wounded, 1 unconscious. "Lieutenant," someone yelled, "we're cut off, no exit." Sarah's mind raced, then stopped. She could see it, a gap in the wall barely wide enough for a body. Beyond it, open desert. "Go through," she ordered. "What about you?" "I'll cover." "No, Lieutenant." "Move." She turned, grabbed the rifle of a fallen comrade, and faced the alley. Figures appeared through the smoke, 5, maybe 6, armed, advancing. Her heart slowed, her breathing steadied. She aimed, fired once, twice, 3 times. Each shot precise, deliberate. The 4th round jammed. She dropped the rifle, drew her sidearm, and kept shooting. When the last body fell, she realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from rage. The kind that came when you realized you were still alive, and someone else wasn't supposed to be. When the helicopter finally arrived, she refused to be carried. She limped aboard under her own power, blood still pouring from her leg. Only when they were airborne did she let herself look down at her hands, streaked with red, trembling against the floor. Someone pressed gauze against her wound. A voice said, "You're lucky, Lieutenant." She stared out the window at the burning compound below. "No," she said quietly, "I'm alive. That's not the same thing." Back in the present, Sarah sat alone in the Academy's training office, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. She'd avoided thinking about Kandahar for years, but the memory came back now, vivid, relentless. Maybe because of the cadets. Maybe because she saw something of herself in them. The recklessness, the doubt, the quiet fear hiding behind pride. She closed her eyes. The sounds of the desert faded into the low hum of the academy grounds, the laughter of younger cadets training outside. The world was different now, but the lessons hadn't changed. Pain was still the best teacher. Later that afternoon, She called Reynolds and his team into the briefing room. They stood at attention, mud still on their boots from the morning's drills. Sarah placed a file on the table, worn, edges frayed. "Today," she began, "we're not training for endurance, we're training for memory." Reynolds frowned. "Ma'am." She slid the file toward him. Inside were faded photographs, satellite images, mission notes, casualty reports. "Kandahar 2012, she said quietly. "My last field mission." Wilson's brow furrowed. "You're showing us classified ops." "Declassified now. What matters isn't the details. It's what happens when things go wrong." She pointed to a line on the report. "Mission successful. Casualties, 2 KIA, 4 WIA." "I led that team," she said. "We completed the mission, but we didn't all come home." Reynolds looked up slowly. "What happened?" Sarah's voice stayed even. "We underestimated chaos, assumed control, lost it, learned the hard way that leadership isn't about giving orders, it's about taking responsibility when everything falls apart." No one spoke. She looked at Reynolds, then at each of them. "You think you understand fear. You don't. Not until you've heard a man call your name and known you can't reach him in time." Her tone dropped almost to a whisper. "That's why I push you, because war doesn't care about excuses. It only remembers results." The room stayed silent for a long time. Then Reynolds said quietly, "Did you ever stop blaming yourself?" She met his gaze. "No, you don't stop. You just learn to live with the echoes." He nodded slowly. "Is that what this is? Teaching us so we don't end up with your echoes?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Something like that." That night, after the cadets left, Sarah stayed in the room long after the lights dimmed. The folder lay open before her. A faint desert wind seemed to blow through memory again. She took a deep breath and whispered to the empty air, "I didn't forget you." Then she closed the file, sealing the past inside once more. The following morning, something had changed in the cadets. Their movements were sharper but quieter, not out of fear, out of understanding. They'd seen behind the curtain now, glimpsed the cost of what they were becoming. Sarah led them through another simulation: hostage recovery, timed extraction, medical triage under pressure. Reynolds took command again, his tone firm but calm. When Wilson panicked during a fake casualty triage, Reynolds knelt beside him. "Focus. Breathe. Remember what she said, control the mind, the body follows." Sarah watched from a distance, arms crossed. She didn't interfere. They succeeded, barely, but this time it wasn't luck, it was coordination, trust. As they regrouped at the end, Reynolds turned toward her. "Ma'am, I think I understand now." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Understand what?" "What you said, about living with echoes." She nodded once. "Then you're ready for the hard part." His brow furrowed. "What's that?" "Forgiving yourself before you failed." He didn't answer, just stood there, rain mixing with sweat on his face, eyes distant. Sarah turned away, her gaze drifting toward the horizon, where the sky met the sea in a line so thin it barely existed. That was leadership, she thought, that line, that fragile space between strength and breaking. And she had walked it her whole life. That evening, Colonel Tangisdal found her standing alone on the field again, the wind pulling at her hair. "Still chasing ghosts?" the colonel asked quietly. Sarah smiled faintly. "No, just making peace with them." Tangisdal nodded. "You ever think about going back, field work?" Sarah's eyes stayed on the setting sun. "No, I've already fought my war. Now I teach others how not to start theirs." The colonel studied her for a long moment. "They're changing, Reynolds especially." "I know," Sarah said softly. "That's why I won't go easy on them." Tangisdal smiled. "You sound like me now." Sarah's eyes glinted with something between pride and sadness. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's how it works. One generation breaks, the next one learns how not to." The colonel looked toward the field, where the flag rippled faintly in the evening light. "That's the closest thing to peace we ever get." Sarah nodded, "And maybe that's enough." The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of cadets laughing somewhere in the distance, free, alive, unaware of the ghosts who had built the ground beneath their feet. And Sarah Mitchell, once a soldier, now a teacher, closed her eyes against the wind. For the first time in years, she didn't hear gunfire when she did. She just heard rain. The academy was never supposed to feel dangerous. It was a place of order, of whistle calls and strict schedules, of uniforms pressed so sharply they could cut air. But that morning, as the sirens wailed across the compound, order evaporated. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood at the command window, watching cadets scramble for shelter. Her radio crackled with overlapping voices. "Possible armed intruder near Hangar C. Repeat, live weapon confirmed. All units in lockdown protocol." Sarah's hand tightened around the radio. Hangar C, that was less than 300 meters from the training yard, where her cadets were supposed to be. "God," she whispered, already moving. Reynolds and his team had been mid-drill when the siren hit. The sound was sharp, metallic, like a blade cutting through calm. Wilson dropped his practice weapon. "Is this a drill?" Briggs shook his head. "No, not that tone." Reynolds scanned the field. The other cadets were rushing toward the main hall, following safety procedure. But his gut, the instinct Sarah had drilled into him, told him to move differently. "Gear up," he said quickly. Tanner blinked. "What? We're supposed to head inside." "Gear up," Reynolds repeated, already slinging his pack over his shoulder. "If this isn't a drill, we might be the closest team to the hangars, and if anyone's in danger." Wilson hesitated. "You think she'd want us doing this?" Reynolds looked at him. "She didn't train us to hide." They moved. Sarah reached the training yard seconds later, empty. Her pulse spiked. "Reynolds," she muttered under her breath, scanning for movement. Her radio flared again. Reports of 4 cadets seen moving toward Hangar C, possibly armed. Her heart sank. "Of course." "Reynolds, if you're out there," she whispered, already running, "you'd better remember everything I taught you." The hangars loomed ahead, massive, skeletal structures lined with maintenance gear and aircraft simulators. The air smelled like oil and heat. Reynolds and his team crouched behind a stack of crates near the entrance. Inside, voices echoed, sharp, panicked. "Shut it down," I said, "shut it down." A single figure paced the floor, civilian maintenance uniform, rifle in hand. Tanner whispered, "He's not military, probably a contractor." Reynolds studied him. The man's movements were erratic, too controlled to be random, too emotional to be trained. He was sweating, muttering under his breath. Wilson whispered, "He's losing it. We should wait for security." Reynolds shook his head slowly. "No time. Look, fuel lines open." They followed his gaze. A trail of aviation fuel was spreading across the floor, inching toward a line of electrical equipment. One stray spark, and the entire hangar would go up. Reynolds took a breath. "Tanner, flank left. Wilson, find an extinguisher. Briggs, cover me." He didn't realize it, but his voice, calm, clear, decisive, was the same tone Sarah used in every drill. The same tone that had once cut through his arrogance. Sarah reached the hangar perimeter seconds later, her boots splashing through shallow puddles of fuel. The smell hit her instantly. Her instincts screamed times short. Through the half-open door, she caught movement, Reynolds' silhouette. Her pulse jumped. "Damn it, Reynolds." She drew her sidearm, lowered her stance, and entered quietly. The contractor's voice echoed. "They don't listen. None of them listen." He swung the rifle toward the shadows. "You think this place makes heroes, it makes killers." Reynolds froze behind a crate. The man's eyes were wild, but his finger was on the trigger. Sarah could see everything now, the cadets spread in cover formation, moving with precision. Controlled, silent. She felt something flicker in her chest, pride, terror, both. "Put the weapon down," she called out, stepping into the open. The man spun toward her instantly, eyes narrowing. "You stay back, I'm not going down for this." Sarah didn't lower her weapon. "No one's dying today, you don't want this." He laughed, a broken sound. "You don't know what I want." Sarah's tone softened. "Then tell me." He hesitated, his shoulders trembled. "They cut my contract, said I wasn't fit for duty. After 20 years, you think they care about any of us?" "I care," she said quietly, "but this isn't how you make them listen." Behind him, Reynolds signaled silently to Wilson, who was crawling toward the extinguisher. Sarah saw it, didn't intervene. Timing mattered. "Put the gun down," she said again. "I can't," the man whispered. "I'm already done." And then his finger twitched. The shot rang out. Sarah moved before she thought. The world slowed to fragments, the shattering echo, the flash, the burn in the air. She hit the ground, rolled behind cover. A second shot. Sparks exploded off the metal beam above her head. Reynolds lunged from behind the crates, slamming into the shooter's legs. The rifle clattered to the ground. The man struggled, swinging wildly, but Reynolds held firm. Wilson sprayed the extinguisher across the fuel line, choking the flames before they started. Tanner and Briggs joined, pinning the man down. It was over in seconds. The silence afterward was deafening. Sarah stood, breathing hard. Her ears rang, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Reynolds looked up at her, panting. "Ma'am, target secure." She holstered her weapon, walked forward and helped him up. For a long moment she didn't speak, just looked at him, mud-streaked, sweating, alive. "Who authorized you to move on this?" she asked quietly. Reynolds hesitated. "No one, ma'am." Her jaw tightened. "Then why did you?" He swallowed. "Because I saw what you'd do if it were you." Sarah stared at him. Rain began tapping on the hangar roof, slow, steady, rhythmic. "You disobeyed direct orders," she said finally, "but you did it for the right reason." He blinked. "So we're not in trouble." Her lips twitched. "Oh, you're absolutely in trouble, but you just proved something." He frowned. "What's that?" "That you listened." She turned toward the subdued contractor as the security team rushed in. The man was crying quietly, face pressed against the cold floor. Sarah's expression softened for just a heartbeat. "Get him medical," she said to the guards. "He's not the enemy, just lost his way." Reynolds watched her, something dawning in his eyes. "You meant it, didn't you, when you said leadership, about transformation?" Sarah looked at him. "I always mean it." Hours later, after the incident report was filed and the hangar cordoned off, the academy returned to uneasy quiet. Sarah found Reynolds sitting alone on the bleachers overlooking the field. The sun was setting, sky bleeding orange into gray. She walked up slowly, hands in her jacket pockets. "You handled yourself well today." Reynolds gave a half smile. "Didn't feel like it, thought I was gonna pass out." "Good, means you're human." He chuckled. "You always this encouraging." "Only on days that end with a gunfight." They sat in silence for a while, watching the wind move through the flagpole ropes. Finally Reynolds said softly, "He wasn't a bad guy, was he?" Sarah shook her head. "No, just broken." "Think he can come back from that?" She looked at him, really looked. "Maybe, if someone gives him a chance." Reynolds nodded, thinking, "Like you gave us." Her smile was faint. "That's different." "Is it?" he asked quietly. Sarah didn't answer right away. In truth, she didn't know. She'd spent years teaching others to survive, to rise from failure, to rebuild from guilt. Yet she still hadn't forgiven herself for the faces that haunted her in sleep. She exhaled slowly. "Maybe not." Reynolds turned toward her. "You saved us, ma'am, not just today, from ourselves." She looked down at her hands. The same hands that once dragged a bleeding man through the desert, that once trembled holding a gun against her own fear. "Don't thank me yet," she said softly. "Lessons don't end with victory, they start there." That night she returned to her quarters. The rain had stopped, but the world still smelled like it, clean, washed, temporary. She sat by the window, the light dim, the academy quiet now. On her desk lay the letter from Kandahar. She unfolded it again, tracing the old ink with her thumb. "You could have ended my career," it read. "Instead, you showed me what it means to be a warrior." She smiled faintly. "Looks like I'm still at it, Sergeant." Her radio buzzed, Colonel Tangisdal's voice. "Mitchell, you and your cadets saved lives today. The board's recommending commendation." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "We just did what we were trained to do, ma'am." "You trained them to do it," Tangisdal said. "There's a difference." Silence hung for a moment, then, "You ever wonder," the colonel continued, "why the hardest lessons always come to the ones who don't ask for them?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Because they're the only ones strong enough to carry them." Later she walked outside. The air was cool, sharp with the smell of wet earth. She crossed the field slowly, boots sinking into the soft ground. The hangar lights in the distance glowed like small suns. Reynolds and his team were still awake, sitting in a loose circle under the bleachers, talking quietly. Laughing sometimes. They didn't see her. She watched them for a long time, not with pride but with something deeper, relief. For once her lessons hadn't just saved them, they'd saved someone else. And that mattered more than anything. She turned toward the flag fluttering faintly above her. The wind tugged at it like memory. She closed her eyes. In the distance, thunder rolled faint, harmless. But in her mind, it wasn't thunder anymore. It was applause from ghosts who finally, maybe, forgave her. Because she'd done what they couldn't. Taught others to survive without losing their soul. And sometimes, that was the only kind of victory that mattered. The conference room was too quiet. It wasn't the respectful kind of silence. It was the kind that made your pulse louder, made every breath sound like an intrusion. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat at the center table, hands clasped, eyes steady. Around her, 5 officers from the Academy Review Board took their seats in deliberate, synchronized motion. Their uniforms gleamed. Their expressions didn't. A single folder lay in front of them, labeled Incident Report, Hangar C. Colonel Tangisdal sat at the end of the table, not as her ally this time, but as the presiding officer. Her gaze met Sarah's briefly, then lowered. "Lieutenant," she began, voice calm, measured, but colder than usual, "you understand the purpose of this review?" Sarah nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." "This hearing concerns the actions taken during the security breach on October 22nd. Specifically, your failure to maintain lockdown protocol and your cadets' unauthorized engagement with an armed civilian. You'll be given opportunity to respond." Sarah didn't move, understood. One of the board members, Captain Dyer, older, sharp-eyed, opened the folder. "The security team's report states you arrived at the hangar after your cadets had already engaged the subject. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir." "Then let's be clear," Dyer said, his tone cutting through the still air. 4 unarmed cadets trainees disobeyed a direct lockdown order, entered a hot zone, and subdued an armed individual. You trained them, Lieutenant. You created the protocols they broke. So whose failure was it, theirs or yours? The question landed like a blow. Sarah inhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible. "Neither, sir, it was leadership." A faint stir moved across the table. "Leadership," Dyer repeated, leaning forward. "Your definition of leadership involves letting cadets risk their lives unsupervised." "No," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "My definition of leadership involves teaching them to act when orders aren't enough, to think, to adapt, to decide under pressure." Another officer, Commander Hayes, frowned. You're saying you condone their disobedience. I'm saying I understand it, Sarah said, because I trained it into them, and it saved lives. Dyer's jaw tightened. You're excusing insubordination. I'm recognizing initiative, Sarah countered softly. The same quality this academy was built to cultivate. Sir, I've seen what hesitation costs. I've buried hesitation. The words hung there heavy. Colonel Tangisdal cleared her throat gently. Lieutenant Mitchell, the board isn't questioning your intent, but the regulations are clear. Cadets acted outside of command structure. That cannot go unaddressed. Sarah met her gaze, not defiant but steady. Then address it, ma'am, but don't confuse discipline with wisdom. If you strip initiative out of soldiers, you don't get obedience, you get casualties. Silence again. Dyer flipped another page. And what about your conduct, Lieutenant? You entered an active danger zone alone. Standard protocol required waiting for backup. Sarah's tone didn't change. By the time backup arrived, the hangar would have been gone. Hayes looked down at the file. You mean the fuel leak? Yes, if I'd waited, we'd be discussing body counts instead of paperwork. For the first time, Tangisdal's eyes softened slightly. The board murmured quietly among themselves, flipping through reports. After a moment, Dyer looked up. Lieutenant Mitchell, this academy values your service record. You've served with distinction, but procedure exists for a reason. If every instructor made judgment calls outside of protocol. Sarah interrupted softly. We'd have fewer soldiers who freeze under fire. The room stilled again. Her voice lowered, quieter, almost fragile but unshakable. I've watched good men die waiting for permission to do what they already knew was right. I won't teach that kind of hesitation. The clock ticked once, twice. Tangisdal leaned forward slightly. Lieutenant, the board will deliberate. You're dismissed for now. Sarah stood, saluted, and walked out. As the door closed behind her, Tangisdal's gaze lingered on the empty chair. Outside, the hallway was silent except for the muffled hum of cadet chatter from down the corridor. Sarah leaned briefly against the wall, exhaling. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was. She'd faced live fire, ambushes, and explosions, but nothing ever felt like this quiet scrutiny, this slow dissection of moral choices by men who had never bled for them. Lieutenant. She looked up. Reynolds stood a few feet away, posture tense, eyes uncertain. What are you doing here, cadet? She asked softly. He hesitated. We heard about the review. We wanted to speak. We. Wilson, Briggs, and Tanner stepped out from around the corner, standing in formation, mud-stained uniforms freshly pressed. Sarah almost smiled. You four really don't know when to quit. Reynolds straightened. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. Sarah sighed. At this point, I'm not sure I can stop you. He nodded once. We take responsibility, all of it. We acted without orders. You didn't tell us to move. We did it because we believed someone needed help. That was our call, not yours. Sarah looked at him, silent. He continued, voice steady now. You taught us to adapt, to read a situation, to choose courage over compliance. If that's wrong, then the academy's teaching the wrong war. Wilson added quietly, we didn't act like cadets that day. We acted like soldiers because you taught us how. Sarah's throat tightened, but she hid it behind a measured nod. You realize you just confessed to insubordination. Reynolds smiled faintly. Then at least we learned from the best. She shook her head. You're going to make terrible subordinates. Tanner grinned. That's the idea, ma'am. They laughed softly, a brief human sound echoing through the sterile hall. Sarah turned away before they could see the emotion in her eyes. Get back to your quarters before someone decides to court-martial you for loyalty. Reynolds hesitated, then said quietly, We're not loyal, ma'am, we're grateful. And then they were gone. An hour later, the board reconvened. Colonel Tangisdal addressed the room. The board has reached a decision regarding Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's conduct. Sarah stood again, posture straight, gaze steady. While your actions technically violated standard engagement protocol, Tangisdal said, the board recognizes that those actions prevented potential loss of life. Furthermore, the initiative shown by your cadets under your instruction demonstrates exceptional leadership development. A pause. Therefore, no disciplinary action will be taken. However, your program will undergo review for procedural alignment. Sarah nodded slowly. Understood, ma'am. Tangisdal's tone softened. The board also recommends commendation for the cadets involved for bravery and crisis response under pressure. Sarah blinked, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Thank you, ma'am. Dyer cleared his throat. Lieutenant, one final note. Leadership like yours walks a fine line between heroism and defiance. I suggest you tread carefully. Sarah met his gaze. Sir, I've spent my whole life on that line. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. When the hearing adjourned, Sarah stepped outside into the corridor again. The air felt different, lighter, but still heavy with thought. Tangisdal followed her out, closing the door softly behind them. You handled that well, she said. Sarah smirked faintly, didn't feel like it. Welcome to command, Tangisdal said. It never does. They walked together down the hallway, the sound of distant cadet drills echoing faintly through the concrete. You ever think about leaving? The colonel asked. Sarah's gaze drifted toward the sunlight spilling through the tall windows. All the time. Tangisdal smiled faintly. And yet you're still here. Someone has to be, Sarah said quietly. Someone has to remind them that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act while you're terrified. The colonel nodded. And you? Sarah's lips curved slightly. I still choose. That evening the cadets gathered in the yard. The sun dipped low, painting the field gold. Sarah stood before them, not as an instructor now, but as something else. Tomorrow, she said, the Academy recognizes you for exemplary conduct. You'll be given a citation for bravery. Wear it with humility, not pride. Reynolds smiled slightly. Yes, ma'am. Sarah looked at each of them, her voice softening. You made mistakes, big ones, but you learned what most soldiers never do, that courage without conscience is chaos. She paused, her tone quieter now. Don't chase glory, it dies fast, but integrity that lasts. They stood silent. The words weren't orders, they were something more, a promise. As she dismissed them, Reynolds lingered. Ma'am, he said quietly, you ever miss it, the field? Sarah looked at the horizon, the sea beyond the academy, turning molten under the setting sun. Every day, she said, but not the way you think. He frowned slightly. How that? I don't miss the fight, she said. I miss the purpose. Reynolds nodded. You still have that. Her eyes met his. Maybe now I do. Later she sat in her office. The walls were lined with framed photos, units, teams, faces long gone. The newest edition hung beside them now. A simple print of 4 cadets standing muddy and proud after their first successful exercise. Below it, Reynolds's signature scrawled across the corner. To the one who taught us to aim higher than the target. Sarah smiled just once. Then she turned off the light and stepped outside. The night air was cool, the campus quiet. In the distance, the flag fluttered softly, catching the moonlight. She stopped, hands behind her back, gaze lifted. Sometimes, she murmured to herself, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And under the silver sky, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, soldier, survivor, teacher, finally allowed herself to breathe. The war inside her had gone quiet. And that was enough. 3 years had passed since the Hangar C incident. The academy grounds hadn't changed much. The same brick halls, the same sharp scent of sea salt carried on the wind, the same parade ground where young cadets learned to stand taller than their fears. But Sarah Mitchell had changed. Her hair was shorter now. The lines near her eyes had deepened not from age, but from clarity, the kind that only comes when you finally stop running from ghosts. She still woke before dawn, still ran the perimeter before the sun rose over the bay, but her pace had slowed, not from weakness, from peace. There were no drills scheduled that morning, yet she stood by the training yard anyway, the dew still fresh on the grass. Some habits, she thought, weren't routines. They were memories disguised as motion. From the corner of her eye, she saw the new class assembling, younger, louder, less sure of themselves. She smiled faintly. Every year it began the same way. Fresh faces full of certainty, waiting to learn what it really meant to earn their place. As she turned toward the administration building, the clerk approached, holding a small brown envelope. "Morning, Lieutenant. This just arrived for you. International Post." She took it, brows furrowing at the faded ink. Her name was written in a rough, uneven hand, not military precise, more like something hurried but careful. There was no return address, just a line of coordinates and a single word beneath them. Kandahar. Her breath caught. She waited until she was alone before opening it. The paper inside was creased, stained with dust, a familiar handwriting, discipline now older. "Lieutenant Mitchell. If you're reading this, it means I made it through another one. I'm stationed in Afghanistan. Special operations. My team completed an extraction near the old Helmand compound, maybe a few miles from where your report said you lost your men years ago. The desert's the same. So is the silence. We got out with 15 hostages alive. No shots fired, no casualties, and the whole time I kept hearing your voice in my head. Don't mistake strength for noise. Courage doesn't always shout. I wanted you to know that we did it your way, calm, patient, deliberate. And for the first time, I understood what you meant about control. You taught me that fear isn't the enemy. It's the compass. You also said one day I'd face my own decision between orders and instinct. You were right. Command wanted a full assault. I waited. We waited. Because of that, everyone came home. Thank you for teaching me how to listen, not just to orders but to silence. That's where the truth is. I'm still not perfect, still reckless sometimes, but I remember your lessons more than any manual. You saved me long before you ever had to. And I finally understand what you meant about echoes. We don't escape them. We carry them forward until someone else learns to listen. With respect, Captain James Reynolds. Sarah read the letter 3 times before she could put it down. Outside her office window, the wind picked up, rustling through the flags on the parade ground. For a long while she didn't move. Then she stood, walked to the wall, and pinned the letter beneath the framed academy insignia, beside the old letter from Sergeant Reeves. 2 voices from different wars, both survivors in their own way. She traced her fingers lightly over the paper, her throat tight. Reynolds had been a boy when she met him, arrogant, angry, unaware of how fragile confidence could be when it was tested by life. Now he was leading others, shaping decisions that saved lives. That was the real mission, she thought. Not medals, not glory, the quiet transfer of resilience from one broken soul to another. She stepped outside, the sunlight cutting through the early fog. The new class was running laps, their instructor shouting over the hum of wind. She watched for a while, not as a superior, but as a witness to something continuing. Tangisdal had retired 2 years earlier, replaced by a younger colonel, formal, efficient, respectful. He greeted Sarah whenever they crossed paths, always with the same phrase, "You built the foundation we're standing on." But Sarah didn't believe that. She hadn't built a foundation. She'd only patched the cracks left by the people who came before her, men and women who fought invisible wars long after the visible ones ended. And yet, maybe that was enough. That evening, Sarah sat by the docks behind the academy, the bay stretching wide and endless before her. The water shimmered under the last light of day. She pulled out a small notebook, the one she kept locked in her drawer. Its pages held pieces of her life that never made it into reports, things too small for records, too human for paperwork. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. Kandahar 3 years later. Her handwriting was slow, deliberate. The boy who once aimed a gun at my head is now leading soldiers through a war zone. He wrote to tell me he heard my voice in his decisions. That's the strangest kind of immortality, to exist not in memory, but in another person's conscience. She paused, listening to the waves. We never really leave the battlefield. We just change its shape. It becomes classrooms, conversations, quiet choices made in someone else's moment of fear. Maybe that's how we win. Not by fighting, but by leaving fewer wars behind us than we started with. She stopped writing, looked up. The horizon glowed faintly pink. For the first time, she didn't feel alone when she looked at it. The next morning, during the academy's assembly, Sarah stood at the back of the crowd while the commandant gave his address. The cadets stood in rows, sunlight glinting off their polished insignia. She didn't hear much of the speech. Her attention was on one particular group, 4 new recruits standing near the front, whispering nervously to each other. One of them, a young woman with cropped hair and sharp eyes, noticed Sarah watching. Their gazes met briefly. Sarah nodded once, a silent greeting. The cadet nodded back. It was small, but it was enough. After the ceremony, the young woman approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am, you're Lieutenant Mitchell, right? The one who trained Captain Reynolds." Sarah smiled faintly. "That's what they tell me." The cadet's face brightened. "He mentioned you in his briefing, said you taught him that fear's just information." Sarah tilted her head. "He remembered that." "Yes, ma'am. Said it saved his team in Helmand last year." Sarah's lips curved slightly. "Then I suppose the lesson worked." The cadet hesitated. "Ma'am, if I may, why do you still do it? After everything, the war, the loss, the teaching, why stay?" Sarah looked past her, toward the parade ground where the next group of cadets were lining up, awkward, hopeful, unaware of the ghosts walking among them. "Because," she said softly, "the world doesn't stop needing good people just because it breaks the ones who try." The cadet didn't respond right away. Then she nodded slowly, eyes wide with understanding she didn't yet have words for. Sarah smiled again. "What's your name, cadet?" "Lena Ortiz, ma'am." "Ortiz," Sarah repeated, thoughtful. "Report to the training yard tomorrow at 0500. I have a feeling you'll enjoy pain almost as much as Captain Reynolds did." The cadet grinned despite herself. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah turned to leave, her boots clicking softly against the pavement. For a moment she could almost hear laughter, not the cadet, but echoes from years ago. Reynolds, Wilson, Tanner, Briggs, the sound of youth learning humility, of arrogance turning into discipline. That night, Sarah returned to her quarters. She lit a candle, an old habit from deployment days, and placed it near the framed letters on her wall. The light flickered against the paper, making the ink seem alive. Beside the letters lay a small brass coin, her Navy SEAL trident. It had faded with time, the edges worn smooth. She picked it up, holding it against her palm. It wasn't pride she felt. Not anymore. It was gratitude that she'd survived long enough to understand what survival really meant. The candle flame wavered as a draft moved through the room. Sarah looked at it, smiling faintly. "Still here," she whispered. And maybe, for the first time, the silence whispered back. The next dawn broke clear. No sirens, no shouting, just the sound of seagulls and distant waves. Sarah walked the training yard as the new cadets ran their first laps. Their voices carried on the wind, laughter mixed with frustration, the music of beginnings. She stood by the same spot she'd stood years before, when 4 cadets had once mocked her, tested her, aimed a gun at her head. It felt like a lifetime ago. Maybe it was. She watched the sun rise higher over the horizon and thought about everything that had changed and everything that hadn't. Duty, discipline, humanity. 3 words, but the last one had taken her years to understand. Because at the heart of every mission, beneath every layer of protocol and command, there was something simple, the choice to care. And that, she realized, was the only battle that ever truly mattered. As she turned to leave, the wind caught the edge of Reynolds's letter, fluttering it gently against the wall behind her. Her eyes lingered on the final line, one she hadn't noticed before, faintly penciled at the bottom of the page. Some save lives by taking others. You save lives by transforming them. Sarah exhaled slowly, the corners of her mouth lifting. Not just me, she murmured. We all do one lesson at a time. She stepped out into the light. And as the sun climbed over the academy, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell walked forward, not as a soldier haunted by her past, but as a teacher redeemed by it. Sometimes the strongest warriors don't fight battles. They end them. The knock came on a Sunday. It was quiet, deliberate, almost hesitant, the kind of knock that carried familiarity and respect. Sarah Mitchell was in her garden behind the small coastal house she'd moved into after retiring from the academy. Her hands were covered in soil, the scent of salt and pine heavy in the morning air. She hadn't worn a uniform in 2 years. She didn't miss it. The war in her bones had finally fallen silent. When she opened the door, the man standing there took her breath for a moment, not because she didn't recognize him, but because of how much he'd changed. "Captain Reynolds," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Ma'am." She studied him, older now, hardened by command, eyes quieter but deeper. He wore the look all good soldiers eventually wore, the expression of someone who had seen too much but still believed in something. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "You look like you could use coffee." He chuckled. "Yes, ma'am, haven't slept in, longer than I'd like to admit." Inside, the house was simple, neat. No medals on display, no flags, just shelves of books and a framed photograph of the Academy cadets, muddy, exhausted, and smiling. Reynolds noticed it immediately. "You kept that." Sarah poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "You think I'd throw away proof that 4 of my most arrogant students survived?" He grinned. 3 arrogant students. Briggs still says you scared the ego out of him. She smirked. "Good, that was the plan." They sat at the small wooden table near the window. Outside, gulls moved slow circles over the surf. Reynolds sipped his coffee. His hands trembled just slightly. Sarah noticed but said nothing. After a moment, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded letter. "This was supposed to go through official channels, but I figured you deserved to hear it from me." He slid it across the table. She looked down. The seal bore the emblem of the Department of Defense. "What is it?" "Retirement notice," he said quietly. "Effective next month." Sarah looked up surprised. "You're leaving?" He nodded. "I've been in for 12 years, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Syria. I've done my part." "You've done more than that," she said softly. He exhaled. "Maybe, but I can feel it now. The part where you realize you've given enough and anything more starts taking instead of giving." She understood that feeling all too well. "So what's next?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Teaching. Got an offer to train recruits for joint operations. Thought I'd see if I could do what you did, teach them before the world does." Sarah leaned back. "That's dangerous work." "More dangerous than the field." She smiled. "Emotionally, yes." He chuckled quietly, then his tone changed. "Ma'am, I didn't just come to tell you about the retirement. There's something else." Sarah watched him carefully. He hesitated, then said, "Wilson didn't make it back from our last deployment." The room went still. Her fingers tightened around her mug. When? 6 months ago, IED outside Kandahar. Instant. Sarah's breath caught, her voice soft. I'm sorry. He nodded. So was he, but he went out doing what you taught us, covering his team. Silence filled the space between them. The kind that wasn't empty, it was sacred. Finally, Reynolds said, he talked about you a lot, said you were the first person who ever scared him into becoming better. Sarah's lips trembled slightly. I'll take that as a compliment. Reynolds smiled. You should, he meant it. She looked out the window, eyes distant. You never forget the ones who fall. You just learn to speak their names without breaking. He nodded, his jaw tight. Then softly he said, I think you already did that for all of us, ma'am. You taught us how to carry it without letting it consume us. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. After a while, they walked along the beach together. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath their boots. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Reynolds said, You ever wonder what it was all for? The pain, the years, the loss. Sarah glanced at him. All the time. And she smiled faintly. I decided it doesn't need to mean something grand. Sometimes it's enough that it meant something to someone. He nodded, quiet. They walked a little further until they reached a weathered wooden bench overlooking the ocean. Sarah sat. He did the same. The wind was steady, gentle. You know, Reynolds said after a moment, when I first met you, I thought you were impossible, cold, untouchable. You weren't wrong, she said with a small smile. He shook his head. No, I was. You weren't untouchable. You were just holding everything together for everyone else. She looked out at the water. Someone had to. He turned toward her, and now. She met his eyes. Now someone else will. Reynolds smiled. Captain Ortiz. She laughed quietly. Word travels fast. She's good, he said. Reminds me of you. That poor girl, Sarah said, smiling. She doesn't know what she's in for. Neither did we. They both laughed softly, the sound carried away by the sea breeze. When they returned to the house, the light was fading. Sarah poured another round of coffee, but Reynolds didn't touch his. He stood near the wall of photos, eyes lingering on the old one, the four of them on graduation day. Feels like another life, he said quietly. Sarah joined him. That's because it was. He nodded. You know, I still hear your voice sometimes, when things go wrong, when I hesitate. She smiled faintly. I told you the echo never really leaves. He looked at her, eyes soft. Then I hope I never stop hearing it. For a moment, they stood in silence, the kind that comes at the end of long wars and long friendships. Finally, Reynolds reached into his pocket again and placed something on the table. It was her old seal trident. Sarah blinked. How did you? Found it in the Academy's archives when they cleaned out your office, he said. Figured it should be home. She stared at it, the gold dulled with age, edges worn smooth from years of wear. I thought I'd buried that part of me, she murmured. Reynolds shook his head. You didn't bury it, you passed it on. She looked up at him, eyes shining. And then, without ceremony, without rank, she reached out her hand. Thank you, Captain. He gripped it firmly. Thank you, ma'am. Her voice dropped to a whisper. No, James, thank you for proving I was right to believe in you. He smiled, eyes glinting. Guess you were right after all. About what? That courage can be taught. She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. And leadership can be learned. An hour later, he was gone. She watched his car disappear down the road, the taillights fading into the coastal mist. Inside, the house was quiet again, the coffee cup still on the table, the trident gleaming faintly under the soft light. She picked it up one last time, turning it over in her hand. Then she walked to the small box on her bookshelf, the one that held the 2 letters from Kandahar and Reynolds. She placed the trident inside, closed the lid gently, and whispered, Rest easy. It wasn't for the fallen. It was for herself. That night, as she sat by the window, the moonlight spilling across her desk, she opened her notebook one last time. "The mission is over," she wrote, "but the lesson remains." In the end, it wasn't about war. It was about people flawed, afraid, desperate to matter. I used to think strength meant silence. I was wrong. Strength is listening, leading, believing. If these words outlive me, let them carry one truth. The measure of a warrior isn't how many battles they've fought, but how many they've prevented by being better than their anger. She put down the pen. Outside, the waves rolled steady, endless. Somewhere far away, a young captain would be teaching new soldiers how to stay calm in chaos, how to lead without shouting, how to listen to silence. And somewhere else, a cadet would be waking up before dawn, repeating the same words Sarah had once said, the ones that started it all. Your weapon isn't your strength, it's your mind. The world kept turning. The cycle continued. The lesson endured. Sarah closed the notebook, her hand resting on its cover. The candle by her window flickered once, then steadied. She exhaled softly and whispered the same words she'd told herself on the worst night of her life. The night she survived Kandahar, the night she swore to teach instead of fight. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in that silence under the vast, calm sky, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, warrior, survivor, teacher, finally let go of the weight she'd carried for decades. Not in defeat, but in peace. Because the truest victory was never surviving war. It was teaching others how to live beyond it.